You're listening to Developmental, Property and the Mind podcast, where development industry insight meet mindset with Trafalgar CEO Joe Aboud. Join one of the property industry's most free thinkers as he explores the path to success and contentment.
I'm excited today to speak to Steve Mann, CEO of Urban Development Institute of Australia, also known as UDIA. He's from the New South Wales chapter. So welcome, Steve.
Yeah, good, Joe. Good to be here.
Great to have you here. And we've got a lot of topics to talk about today. But before we get into that, what's a day in your life look like?
A day in my life. Busy, that's for sure. So really engaging with politicians is the crucial piece. How can we work with them to build better cities? Thinking about members and, galvanising events and the like. Pretty much it. And
you wear a couple of hats. Obviously, you've got your day-to-day job and you've also got this representation piece at UDIA. Talk to us about the two different hats.
Full-time. It's like more than full-time.
Oh, okay.
So, I'm employed full-time, so that's based on running a membership business, policy being the key driver there. Research, we're leaders in future city thinking and technology. Running an events and training business. That's the guts of how UDIA makes a buck and works for members.
And where did it begin for you?
Yeah, so UDIA itself is the oldest association representing developers, around since the early 60s. It's really been around a while. And look, I heard of UDIA as I was in Stockland's executive. I ran the commercial industrial business for 7 years there, but was around a lot of residential and keep hearing about this UDIA. Now being inside it, it's excitingly different. We work with the breadth of institutions and private investors, and our focus is development, not just property. So development, which is what drives the economy. So I got tapped on the shoulder and asked to come and join it. My career has been about 25 years in property investment and development, working for the funds and working for some big institutions, Westpac and Schroders and Stockland.
What funds did you work for?
Yeah, I worked for Industry Superannuation Property Trust when I was at Westpac, and then launched some unlisted funds when I was at Stockland. And then, major developments. So I developed the Optus headquarters, which was the largest office building for a while in Australia. And big industrials, so intermodal was kind of, so bought the $300 million Moorebank intermodal site.
Yeah, I know a lot about that. So prior to Stocklands and prior to all of these funds, where did you first start in property?
Yeah, coming out of school, I'm not sure I had any great idea of what I wanted to do. My father he was cool. He sort of got alongside me and said, I don't think you're going to take an office job, but something in between would be good. You should be a property valuer. I didn't know what he was talking about, but he worked for a bank at the time called Rural Bank, which became State Bank, and he took me to the head valuer at Rural Bank. Didn't know, again, what the heck they were talking about, but started to sort of find out about it then and, went down that path. Did uni at Hawkesbury Agricultural College, as it was at the time, so now part of Western Sydney University. Yeah, it's been an awesome space to be involved with, just so broad and so much impact. Just learnt right throughout my career and keeping on doing so.
I think the diversity.
Property development touches everything. It really does. It's so broad and important, leaves an incredible legacy, right?
A diverse approach to this industry, I think, is really important. I think the better property guys are the guys that have, worked in a number of industries within the industry, so to speak,
So I've worked in retirement living, I've worked in airports, I've worked short stint in government, but most of my work in property investment development. I didn't do much valuing. Actually, when I started, for those that aren't as old, cash flow had just begun. So I was the very sort of first run of cash flow in university. So that was actually my thing, was building early cash flow models.
So talk to us about what you love. What are you passionate about when it comes to the property industry?
Yeah, it's good. I mean, look, the way I think about it now is my project is Sydney, the mega region. That's my development project. How can I add value, better, faster, cheaper cities? That's my job. And the breadth of that is enormous. It's never ending too, so you've got to be careful with that. And I'm constantly looking for ways to work with members to deliver, better outcomes.
And let's talk about what keeps you motivated and energised on a day-to-day basis.
I think people's really the answer to that. I love working with people, learning from people, trying to add value, trying to be the glue, I guess, is what we try and do. So UDIA prides itself with being the trusted advisor to government and sitting between government and industry. So quite different to some of our peers. We have 26 regional councils as members of UDIA. So we're deeply interested in their story and then trying to bring the developer story and work alongside that. Can be sticky sometimes to be that bit in the middle, but as gold if you can stay the course and try and bring those parties together. So everyone likes to sort of point at everybody else. The councils point at the state and vice versa, and the developers point at everybody else. But if you can find solutions that work across those groups, then that's good outcomes for cities.
So trying to find a bit of a win-win scenario in that situation, or do you never find that balance?
Yeah, maybe not. Sometimes it's more about knowing where to put the finger on the pressure point and sort of demand a solution. We'll show, for example, in a report we're about to release, that the councils in the Sydney when I say Sydney mega region, I'm talking Illawarra to the Hunter. So that, in my mind, the main game, can I be as bold as to say for Australia, Illawarra to the Hunter? What's happening in that region is UDIA's big focus. And for us, we studied the amount of money that councils hold in developer contributions, for example. 4 years ago, that was $2 billion. What's your guess as to what that is today, Joe, 4 years on?
I don't know, but I think I'm paying a fair bit of it.
It's $3 billion. So there's another $1 billion in 4 years that local government can't spend. Now, it's not all their fault, but there's $3 billion sitting there doing nothing. So we've got to find ways of mobilising that and getting infrastructure on the ground.
So what amazes me around that piece is that, you talk to me about, $2 to $3 billion sitting in limbo, right, not being able to be spent yet. Some of the biggest conversation pieces today are value capture and trying to raise more money and do all that kind of stuff. And, as a developer, we see it as the developers would see it. They see it as red tape and, making it, more difficult for supply and putting, downward pressure on supply. Yeah. Why do you think state government or local governments keep pushing for all of these value capture mechanisms that are constantly being requested, to the developer? It's a reality that we all live, whether it's an industry body and dealing with that between, the various stakeholders that you represent, and this money that's stuck there and they can't spend it.
Hugely important subject, right? Infrastructure and the cost of it. And then hugely important to recognise who's delivering it, right? Because it's mostly delivered by developers, somewhat by councils, and very little by the state. The state actually need to realise that's very hard work for them to get infrastructure on the ground. But I think it's not just about pointing fingers too. The problem for councils is they can't get enough funding for that particular project in a plan. So the broader funding grows, but they can't enable the funding towards the particular thing. So if government wants infrastructure to run with development, they've got to learn how to get those funds to work to drive the right piece of infrastructure, the missing piece in infrastructure. So that's where we spend a lot of time in our research with members and with technology tools trying to identify that. But I would say, I think the conversation's become a bit more mature. It's not about pointing at councils, it's about enabling councils and giving them a shove, sure, but they're an important deliverer in the process. Your question was broader around, I'm going to put all of that in the productivity bucket, which I think is an incredibly important bucket. It's not just the work the Productivity Commission has done on developer contributions, it's broader again. Our industry is one of the least productive industries. There's so many delays. I said that to Peter Arkestrat. You haven't come, this is the best industry to go and find productivity gains because they're everywhere. We've got to be able to do things quicker and smarter and more collaboratively than we have in the past.
Why is it that they can't see that that's the solution?
Yeah, great point, Joe. And I think almost above supply, but so what is one of the biggest problems with our residential market in New South Wales? A bumpy ride. A bumpy ride's terrible for all the stakeholders. Bad for government because they haven't got housing when they need it. Bad for industry because we can't meet demand when it's there. We have one of the most bumpy markets in Australia is here in Sydney and New South Wales. And I think my thought on supply would be flexibility. So, for example, with the recent flooding in the Hawkesbury Nepean, the government have frozen any new rezonings in the Northern Growth Corridor. So if you're running a business of supply in Sydney, don't you then go, crikey, we'd better get some stuff done in the south?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what you would want. That's what you'd do as a developer. You'd go, well, that one's slowing down. I need to get something done here. We're not mature enough for that yet, but that's where we need to be. That's where we're focusing on bringing the tools. So what? So this thing's happened. So what are we going to do to react and drive supply? And if you had that more regular level of supply, then you can meet demand, right? You meet the demand where it is. The market will look after that for you. So it's become, interestingly, if rezoning was the pathway to unlocking things back, say, 5 or 10 years ago, I think enabling infrastructure is actually the pathway to unlocking the future. It's not just the approval, right? Because we're getting approvals with no infrastructure.
And therefore, they're not really forecasting it correctly. But before we get to the future, I want to talk about the past quickly.
Oh, yep.
Right? We want to talk about, COVID and sort of how you guys managed, or you yourself managed through the past year.
Yeah, so, COVID's obviously not past, and I think that in itself is interesting. So we've all had to deal with the initial hit. I think we were 15 weeks out of the office initially, and we were right on top of running our national congress. We run it once every 5 years. It's about a $2 million enterprise. So I led the position to give members all their money back, which for an association was huge. But with support and with the right work from our partners, we ended up losing absolutely nothing.
That's amazing.
So it was a tough start into COVID, really tough start. And then how do you keep your brand alive? How do you have impact for members? So we launched an advocacy platform called Project Bounce Back that had 15 recommendations for government. 12 of those 15 were delivered. So we're super pleased with that platform. There were some more disappointing parts of it. The acceleration piece didn't have a major impact on private development, but it certainly, it made a difference in the industry. And there were other parts that were crucially important to keep us as an essential service and to deliver some of the reforms that are now on the agenda.
So let's talk about acceleration for a quick moment. How do you find that now? Okay, we've been through what we think is the worst part of COVID. I don't think it's gone, no. And I don't think it will leave us for a while. I think I think it's with us for a fair time to come. If you have a look at the countries overseas and the way they're dealing with it, there's new spikes of cases and various bits and pieces with that. Yeah. So it's evolving in its own way. The question I have for you though is, now that we've been through the worst part of what I believe is the worst part of that, have you seen the acceleration truly happen? You spoke there that you didn't believe that the acceleration piece worked in industry's favour as much as it probably should have. And are you seeing a sense of where we seem to be going back to the pre-COVID agenda that seemed to be happening pre-COVID?
Yeah, I think that was my comment initially, that COVID's not over. So I think one of the things we will live with, whatever happens with the pandemic, is the scenario planning of what if, right? So what if is now a real thing, and we kind of have a bit of an idea of what that looks like. We've got no idea in Australia compared to other countries, right? But we've learnt to shut down, to adapt, and we've been accelerated in some areas in terms of virtual contact and the like. I think the thing that's really hanging out there for COVID is, what does it mean for cities? The way I would think about it is that the global mega trends, globalization, technology, some of those things, they haven't changed, but they're going to have to be flexible. They will have moved somewhat. I don't think we know yet. So the talk of going to the regions, is that real yet? There's no huge percentages, but what does that mean? Is that at a certain stage in your life, or can families start really working differently? The localization, is that going to be a big thing to drive local economies and the corner shops back? Don't know, I think. What does it mean for transport if people aren't going on public transport on Mondays and Fridays? Because that's the flex day, I think those things are still to be worked out. I think we've done an incredible job to respond quickly, and I'm constantly amazed at the economic position we're in at the moment. I think we're working off a lower base now, so there's still a bit of a story in those numbers. But heck, it's way better than we ever thought, right? So I think the next bit for city makers is faster rail. Is that still going to be metros? Is that still the right approach? I'm not sure we quite know some of that yet.
So I get all that bit. I want to concentrate a little bit on the planning side of that. So pre-COVID, we almost experienced what I called a planning meltdown,
right?
Because we were faced with, various stakeholders, various ministers, various people really wanting to push the power back to council. So my question to you is, are you feeling that now that kind of most people feel that COVID is a fair portion of it is behind us?
Yeah.
Are you starting to get a sense of the old guards coming back in, trying to push that old agenda back?
Yeah. There's a couple of answers to that, I think. The way I want to go with it is, the message I gave to the planning minister at the start of this year was 2020 was not a year of planning reform. He choked a bit, as you might imagine, but I think he wore it. And I said to him, but this year is. And I said, scarily so. So what we've got and what you've got as a development cohort is pretty well every part of your industry being touched by reform. It's pretty darn massive and it's exciting. There's a whole bunch of good things happening, but the coordination of that and the delivery of that towards a more productive outcome is, I guess, the big challenge. So the quick summary on that, we've got, let's see if I can get this right. So we've got the developer contributions reform, which is the response to the Productivity Commissioner's paper. That is a massive piece of reform. It will be delivered this year, so that in itself is pretty scary. And largely, its most positive piece is lower, broader based taxing. Now, we could go anywhere. All 29 recommendations have been accepted by the minister, but the implementation of that is massively complicated. We've got the Treasurer's property tax reform. So I have put together an industry working group to drive that reform. We're like about 12 meetings into that this year. Very simple idea, massively complex in implementation. Simple idea is get rid of stamp duty, offer a choice initially to go with stamp duty or property tax, being a sort of lower base annual payment. So if you've paid your stamp duty, carry on. When you're doing a transaction, make a choice. Each property gets one, not person, each property gets one chance at making a choice. Good for government because it stops the bouncy stamp duty ride. Potentially good for industry because it reduces the upfront price. Interestingly, when you think about it, because it's based on unimproved land value, it's particularly positive for apartments because they don't have as much land as greenfield. Greenfield not as positive, but it's still okay. So the crossover period between property tax and stamp duty is about 13 years for greenfield if you're an owner occupier, and it's about 35 years if you're an owner occupier of an apartment. So it really is very effective to go down property tax for apartments, just because of the way the land and the pricing works.
Because they're sharing.
The complications then become all the different sectors. But I'm only 2 reforms in. I've got to get a couple of others, don't I? So that design and place SEP that I mentioned is potentially a small piece of work that's become absolutely massive. So we'll touch ADG, it will touch greenfield and tree canopies. It's about place, a lot of nice, warm, fuzzy words, but potentially creates a lot more steps in the design process, which is not what we want, and cost. And I guess fourthly, you've got to mention the Building Commissioner's work. So I sat on the Upper House inquiry as an expert witness. That was tough back in 2019. I felt industry needed to be represented and we needed to realise that we had to do a better job of apartments for consumers. And we're now 2 years into that process and I think we're starting to make some ground. We have to ensure that we're delivering good outcomes for customers and making sure that our delivery process works. So I think every developer will have to have moved every developer of apartments has to move closer to how that delivery process works whether it's D&C or whether it's in-house, you've got to understand the risks, the outcomes, the process for delivering, that product.
Yeah, look, I agree that that's a problem. I'm going to go back and suggest boldly that the solution to better outcomes is going to be supply again, right? So by that I mean, if the developer was supported in delivering the supply in a timely fashion and all that kind of stuff, and you start to streamline the process of the pre-construction or the pre-development delivery process. So, there's a bit of responsibility that needs to be taken here from various layers within the process, and I think everyone's missing that, unfortunately.
Right with you, Joe. I reckon housing prices have gone up close to 100% in the last, I think it's about 8 years. What would have this industry been like if it hadn't have gone up? That's the scary thing. We are driving housing prices up.
It's being priced into it to survive.
It's being priced in.
That's it.
So some of the housing affordability problems, a big chunk of it, is due to this inability to run really a manageable pipeline. All of you developers work on your pipelines, and when one's not happening here, you flip to the next one and you go and get solutions there. You've got to keep a business and an income coming through. Should be the same thing with the supply pipeline. You should have this robustness to knowing that it's coming through the system, to accelerating when you need to ensuring that the engine's working, right? And we just don't. We don't have enough. It's too much of a bumpy ride, as I said before, and it is just so rare that supply meets demand. Effectively, supply meets demand at the top and at the bottom.
Look,
Never in between, right?
I'm with you, and I think the only thing that has allowed us to survive to date is been the fact that I forced us as a company to diversify heavily, right? So I went into various different asset classes, and that's the only thing that's kept me alive.
Yeah, right.
Because if the medium density stuff that I normally do isn't working, I've got some greenfield or brownfield stuff.
Yeah.
Some land release stuff, some subdivisions, some retail, some industrial now, some high tech industrial now. So I went with a really diverse portfolio consciously to be able to keep us alive, and that's the only thing that's kept us going. Had I just stuck to what I'm really good at, which is the medium density and high density space, I'd be in all sorts of bother today.
Yeah.
Right. So diversifying here, which is the thing that kept us alive. So it leads us into the challenges that we have ahead of us.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the challenges now that we've got ahead of us. We've got things like housing affordability and making build to rent work.
Well, it's interesting you just mentioned diversification, right? Because there's one, build to rent. So build to rent is potentially the biggest change in 50 years for the housing continuum, right? It's that big.
Sorry, for the corporate and for the mainstream, but
doesn't work.
That's
the problem.
Yeah, in Sydney it doesn't. Okay,
Yes.
I want to rephrase that. I think it works in Sydney, but I think it works in Western Sydney.
Yeah.
But I know that I've been having some heavy discussions with industry, private equity, all that kind of stuff to see what the appetite is, where it needs to go.
Yeah.
And for someone like us that prides themselves on buying well, we're able to make build to rent work, right? There's a whole heap of efficiencies that will flow on for us as a property investor long term. Like we're playing a really long game now.
Yep.
This short game doesn't work for us anymore. So build to rent is one of the pieces that we're discussing. And private equity at the moment doesn't want to be in Sydney unless it's in the inner city or eastern suburbs, right? It's a bit of a contradiction to look for affordability and affordable housing in inner city and the eastern suburbs, man, because affordability is out the door. There's no way you're going to make it work under any circumstance unless you're willing to take a massive haircut. So we've already established that it ain't going to work in Sydney within a few kilometre radius of the CBD. Doesn't work. You're only left with Western Sydney, maybe South Sydney, maybe Northwest Sydney, maybe, right? So they're the areas that we're exploring at the moment. We're talking to economists and various people to get an understanding of what are the triggers and the drivers that we need to understand in order to make it work. So I need to be able to reverse it. So I've got the property and I've got the density and I've been able to buy it well enough. But one of the pieces one of the private equity guys was telling me is, who wants to live in Western Sydney? So how do I get enough interest in a long-term renter, right, a medium or long-term renter, to stay long enough to be able to play a long game like build to rent?
1 million people want to live in Western Sydney.
I'm with you.
I think that's a throwaway line. Let's go back to it. Fundamentals. Build to rent has been ready to go in this country for about 2 decades. It's been going internationally for a very long time, and there's trillion-dollar portfolios in many countries. So interestingly, we're a laggard in that space, and it's rare that we are in residential. We've been a leader in residential markets globally. So in this one, we're a laggard. Why are we? Well, in part, we're a victim of our own success. The investment in residential is a well-trodden path for mums and dads in Australia, not so much internationally. So our yields are very low, and that's been the problem that build to rent has struggled to get its head around those low returns. Now, right now, of course, we've got the lowest interest rates ever. So if we can't get it right now, we're not going to get it right at all. And that capital will focus on total return. So it will focus on a hold period and, looking for the capital return at the same time.
But the capital doesn't want it. This is the problem. I don't think we've got a capital product or a banking product to suit that asset class yet. The money wants to go into it, but it's got really difficult and very high thresholds or CPs for us to be able to have to comply with in order to have that, to convince them to invest the money with us.
So that's why it's growing in Melbourne, right? Because the land prices are lower. It's that simple. I think for Sydney, we're a different city to Melbourne. We're far more spread out. We're
totally different.
Polycentric, excitingly so. And we are in terms of our apartment delivery, right? It's much more broad. If you analyse it for Melbourne, it's pretty much the city plus a bit, whereas here it's spread. So the West is on, baby. It's the city of the future, right? It is the growth engine. It's actually the globally competitive piece the city needs to get right. It doesn't need to get the East right. It's working. It'll keep growing, but getting Western Sydney right is what's holding us back. There's already a big population that love it out there and invest well. They've got means and everything in between, right, as there is in all cities. So I'm pretty confident that the Penriths, the Liverpools, the Campbelltowns, the Camdens, they're going to be strong locations of the future, and we need jobs there. We need this type of housing flexibility there. And I think, if you can add that together with the flexibility that build to rent offers, the community that it offers, it can get a premium rent. It needs a premium rent. To get it on the ground, what we've got to do is incentivise it, really. You've got to prefer it, and maybe prefer it close to railways, right? Because that's where the thing's really going to work.
Oh, well, you can't put those kind of densities unless you're within 500 minutes to a station anyway.
That's what they do all around the globe. In the US, they'd say to you, what do you do in a bad residential market? We build to rent, or they're multifamily, right? And when we were over there in 2018, that's all we saw them building. There was no condos being built. It was just build to rent. So it's a mainstay. It's well understood. And I think the challenge for us is to continue to go after the Australian dream, which is home ownership, but to find build to rent a place in that 25 to 35-year-old story where people want more flexibility, they want more community, and they still want to buy a home later on.
It's, I think, one of those situations where if we truly could find collaboration between government and stakeholder and came up with a brainstorming session that actually incentivised rather than penalised the delivery guys, right, we'd probably find that missing piece.
Well, here's an idea. We're building these metros. Metro's the new thing for Sydney. We're going to be building one in Western Sydney to the new airport. What about if you mandated that there was 2 build-to-rent towers on every Todd railway station? You'd actually then get density happening more quickly, and you gave the right planning position to get that happening, right? Yeah, I think sometimes it's that integration piece that you've got various people focused on their part of the story and not enough integration across government to deliver a complete package. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, and I think you're right before, but planning ahead enough to become a true global city is where it needs to go.
Yeah.
You know, great jobs, great work. You know, and finding a balance in between all that is where it sits. And if you can provide that in the build-to-rent space within there, like close to those metros, in the CBDs, all that kind of stuff, I think it's a lay down
pretty much a no-brainer, isn't it?
No, I think so too.
You want it there.
Look, I think so too. And guys like us can help deliver that.
The interesting link potentially is to affordable housing too, whether you try and marry those. They don't marry entirely well, but they do physically. So the outcome you're looking for, smaller apartments and some community space, kind of ticks the box for affordable housing too. So whether you can find the incentive there, not even necessarily in the same building, right? Maybe it's in a related TOD type incentive.
Now you're getting them to look outside the square. And it's already hard enough in the building. Yeah, look, really, really interesting challenges ahead of us.
So we've been doing a lot of thinking in how can we use technology to enable city planning. And it sort of began about 5 years ago, where we recognised that as an industry we were laggards in using technology, a bit of self-reflection. How could we work with members, put forward some R&D money and our own time to develop these platforms? And we've had a really good go at it, and it's pretty exciting. It's kind of maturing. So if I'm to sort of paint a picture of future city planning technology, the pieces we've got at the moment. So Urban Pinboard was a business we launched in partnership last year, and it has the ability to co-design in 3D a future city, put in place within the existing city, and to stream all of the planning layers. So we stream from the New South Wales government constantly all of the planning layers to that model. We can then, the pin bit is that we can send it to anybody and get their comments on what's proposed. So you can actually work within a COVID landscape really well, and you can plan with different stakeholders, with different securities, all sorts of ways. It's really powerful. So we changed the government's agenda on Camellia, for example, that's currently being replanned as a place strategy because of our urban pinboard model at Camellia. Next, so that's one leg of the chair. The next leg of the chair would be urban AI. So we recognise that with Metro coming, that we needed city planning to run in a similar line as transport planning. Well, transport planning, Metro's a 100-year plus type investment. Cities, well, heck, the longest thing we do is 20 years. And often when we do those plans, we're 2 years into them when we've done them. So it's 20 or thereabouts. So we don't strategically plan long enough. But if those railway stations are going to be around for 100 plus, maybe 200 years, we've got to have some idea what that city looks like. So we built a model that for Western Sydney, we put 18 TOD railway stations, which we can move immediately. I can drop a synthetic city into those TOD stations. We've done one. It's got 24,000 buildings in it. And I know the value of an apartment in every single one of those buildings. So what we've done is we've taken domain data, so 3 million transactions over 17 years. Mm-hmm. Domain data is all physical, so 3 bedrooms, red brick, got a swimming pool, blah, blah, blah. Same for apartments. We've got all the geospatial things for every one of those sales. Where's the shopping centre? Where's the job? Where's the beach? Where's the school? Where's the church? Yada, yada. So when you do a synthetic city, it just asks the same question. So here's my fake city in that TOD with a railway station. Mm-hmm. Oh, and guess what? There needs to be 102 schools in Western Sydney. So the amount of work using computational design, using AI valuation, we can model a future city, and we've done it. And we can move those railway stations at a click of a finger and remodel a city in about 4 minutes.
And is that a service you provide, or?
Look, what we're trying to do is convince government that we can plan a better future city, that we can make sure the city's not an afterthought. Much more challenging for them because they've got to work out what happens to land values and who knows what and blah, blah. But if we're not building, the best city we could, then, we're under-delivering for the community in Sydney, and we've got to find a way of these tools. So that's 3 legs, no, 2 legs. Third leg, infrastructure, enabling infrastructure. We've just been agreeing that it's one of the big ones in that story. So if you want to build that particular development what's the missing piece in water, sewer, power, roads. That's what enables development to get on the ground. In the past, UDA has run a piece of work called Building Blocks, where we map that compared to greenfield lot release. We price it and we put timing on it. We can now do that all in a 3D city model. So you can map the enabling, I call it the enabling infrastructure investment frontier live if you wanted to. So we've got that project now funded by this program over here. We've got a developer wanting to fund part of that piece, right? We've got that going. Here's the next piece. No, it's not the last piece of pipe. It's a big sewer pumping station that takes 7 years to build.
So integrates it
We
on
better
a
get on with
level.
it.
Yeah, okay.
So industry should be able to participate in that, and government should be able to put their money where they get the best return, if you like, for the city in terms of supply and outcomes. So that'd be my third leg, and basically this is all running. So we ran a big pilot with 4 councils in southwest Sydney, with the New South Wales Digital Twin, with DPI themselves. So UDP will start as a program again in July, and then we're really pressing the government vision to be much bigger almost around scenario business cases. How can you create a much quicker, more common conversation about the business case, so that you can mobilise capital? Might be the 7-Eleven capital, might be developer capital. As we know, our machine often needs momentum. Once it's got momentum, it'll feed itself and off you go. So that's 3 legs. Might need a 4th leg for the chair to stand. I haven't quite got the 4th leg yet, but probably is in social media. It probably is in the effectiveness of the city and the way the city is working in areas and not working in other areas. So you can already track spend, which parts of the city where spend is working or not working. You can track using the ping off a mobile phone which parts of a park are the best parts of the park.
So is it the communications piece you're talking about?
Well, I think that could be the sort of 4th leg of this future city sort of space. And then what you need to do, I think, is almost trust the punter, throw it back to the community and say, well, how are we going to build this city together? What's your city look like? Because if you don't have density, then you can't have infrastructure. And with density, we can deliver these great parks or these great places. The two sort of come together. So you can show, we could even do design charrettes all in 3D, where you could listen to, right, the community feedback is blah, blah, blah. Overnight you could come back and say, well, there it is, but the problems are here and here. Why don't we put those two pieces together and it looks like this? So that's sort of a big piece of thinking for us. So we've now launched that as a business. It's driving outcomes for developers now.
So the developers are your customer right now?
They're the customer of the joint venture, that's right.
Yeah.
And then I throw advocacy problems at it. So, for example, I'll use Sir Leonard's Crow's Nest, where some of that was a good piece of work, but it got lost. It happened too quickly. There wasn't enough focus on feasibility, and the densities that have landed won't deliver. Interestingly, it won't deliver for the state government either, because the state government have said to that community, oh, you'll get all this community infrastructure. Well, they won't if they don't get the development, because there'll be no funding for it.
That's where the money's coming from.
So infrastructure, good density, if you like, and delivering for the community, they've got to come together, which means more collaboration, more integration. The collaboration word's almost been overused, right? More integration, which government find difficult.
Yeah, that's the thing. Collaboration or integration, or call it what you like. At what point do you get to sit around the table and actually listen and actually put the work in motion, right? As opposed to just going to an industry lunch or dinner or workshop and they listen, and they leave the meeting saying, yeah, we'll do what we can, and then they've just ticked the box because they've just consulted with everybody and they go and do what they want anyway.
No, that's right. I think that's where the word collaboration's been overused. We need considered consultation, meaningful consultation.
Yeah, constructive, and we're actually
collaborative.
The people actually have a true say. It's actual collaboration where the suggestions are put into play, and only at that point will we see real progress, I think. What do you think? No,
I agree, and I think we're back to where we're talking about forecasting and how do you have a sustainable supply. You've got to know the problems with getting that supply on the grounds, and then what are you going to do if you hit the next challenge, that the market's off, or like we've had with COVID. How do you change? I gave that example of the flood in the northwest. So how do you respond in the southwest? What do you do in the regions when that happens?
And how do you get the people to embrace change? That's another big topic.
Yeah, well,
right?
and I'm almost trying to say trust them. Show them more of it. Make them make some decisions. Where are your kids going to live? They're not going to live in Sydney if we can't provide, supply and good environments. And why the heck can't you live in Campbelltown with a great coffee shop on the ground floor, beautiful views, and you travel to the city, 2 or 3 times a week? Gold, right? So Western Sydney, I think with COVID, it's on, mate.
Look, I'm totally a massive supporter of Western Sydney. That's where I was born. I was raised there, and I'll never forget where I come from. And I live in the northwest at the moment, but still, we've got a fair bit of investment in the west, and we think that's the future.
Yeah.
Whether it's Penrith or whether it's in some of the greenfield stuff that we've got, or whatever the case may be, it's the west for us. It's always been the west for us.
Yeah.
That's where we grew up, and that's what's put us on the map. We'd never forget that.
So interestingly for me, I think about inclusion more now. I find that easier. So how can I make sure that the people I'm working with are included? What are the barriers to that, and how do I encourage them to step forward? That's a really important role at UDIA. How do we grow people, connect people?
Empower them.
Empower them, great. And then when you think about the people we're building for, well, they're diverse, right? So if you got your head in the sand on that stuff, it won't work.
Yeah, look, empowering is probably my favourite word. As a leader in this company and hopefully a leader in the industry, for me, empowerment is being the very foundation that I've built this business on.
Yeah.
I love to see people flourish. I love to see people do well, and I think including them in all that and empowering them in the decision making. And my favourite question to somebody that comes and asks me what to do next is, if this was your business, what would you do? And they always say, well, I would do A, B, C, and D. And I say, okay, well, let's go and do it. So that's been a really successful part for us, and I think inclusion and diversity is definitely an important piece here.
Takes a bit of guts, doesn't it? Sort of got to get,
like you said before, I think you've got to put a little bit of trust in those people, right?
Trust.
Give them some responsibility to take, and you see a different side of them, right? Let them put a bit of skin in the game. It doesn't have to be money. It's just a little bit of a decision or a bit of responsibility, and you always see an amazing outcome.
Yeah, it's like gold, isn't it? I think too that takes you to legacy stuff too. It's like thinking in that space, and I think as developers, it's a really, really important space because what we do lasts so long, has such an incredible impact. So there's a great sense of pride and responsibility as you start to think like that. I want to do things really well because they're going to be there for a long time, and I think that's good stuff.
Yeah, it's a special kind of person to be able to take on the responsibility to drive and deliver these massive outcomes.
Maybe we can be so bold. It's a special type of industry too. If we're starting to do it together.
It is. I think if it wasn't a special kind of industry, I don't think I would have lasted, and I don't think you would have lasted. Definitely, right?
Yeah.
So, mate, look, awesome talking to you today. Been an absolute pleasure. I learnt so much from you today, and I'm forever grateful for you giving us some time to share your wisdom with us. It's been amazing, and hope to talk to you again in the not too distant future.
All good. Cheers.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks for listening to Developmental, Property and the Mind podcast. Stay tuned for our next episode, available wherever you get your podcasts. Or to talk to Joe, visit trafalgar.com.au. That's TRIFALGA.com.au.